Social media psychological manipulation programs. The ACLU's research into Section 230 and algorithmic amplification shows how social media platforms became vehicles for spreading conspiracy theories and disinformation at unprecedented scale. While privacy advocates were fighting government surveillance programs, tech companies were building their own systems for monitoring and influencing user behavior through algorithmic content curation. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act gave platforms broad immunity from liability for user-generated content. But it also created an environment where algorithmic amplification could operate without meaningful oversight. The Pew Research Center found that social media algorithms consistently promoted sensational and emotionally charged content because it generated higher engagement rates, which translated directly into advertising revenue. The conspiracy theories about algorithmic manipulation weren't entirely wrong, they just focused on the wrong mechanisms. Instead of deliberate psychological experiments, the platforms were using engagement optimization algorithms that had similar effects on user behavior. Content that provoked strong emotional responses, whether anger, fear, or outrage, received algorithmic boosts that increased its reach and visibility. These algorithmic systems created what researchers called filter bubbles and echo chambers, where users were primarily exposed to content that reinforced their existing beliefs and biases. The algorithms learned that controversial and polarizing content kept users engaged longer, so they systematically promoted conspiracy theories, political extremism, and divisive social issues over factual information and balanced perspectives. The ACLU documented how these algorithmic amplification systems disproportionately affected marginalized communities and vulnerable populations. Conspiracy theories about vaccines, election fraud, and government surveillance spread faster and reached larger audiences than authoritative sources debunking those theories. The platform's business models incentivized the spread of misinformation because controversial content generated more user engagement. Pew Research found that users who spent more time on social media platforms showed increased belief in conspiracy theories and decreased trust in traditional news sources and government institutions. The algorithmic curation systems weren't just reflecting user preferences, they were actively shaping those preferences by controlling what information users encountered and how frequently they encountered it. The platforms defended their algorithmic systems by claiming they were simply giving users content they wanted to see, but internal research showed the companies understood how their algorithms influenced user beliefs and behaviors. They knew that promoting emotionally charged content increased engagement metrics, and they prioritized those metrics over concerns about misinformation or social harm. Former employees who became whistleblowers revealed that content moderation policies were inconsistently applied and often overruled by engagement optimization algorithms. Posts that violated community guidelines but generated high engagement were allowed to remain visible, while factual content that didn't generate strong emotional responses was algorithmically suppressed. The conspiracy theory communities that formed on these platforms weren't just organic grassroots movements, they were partially products of algorithmic systems designed to maximize user engagement. The algorithms identified users who showed interest in conspiracy content and then fed them increasingly extreme theories to keep them scrolling and clicking. Legal challenges to Section 230 protections have focused on whether platforms should be held liable for algorithmic amplification of harmful content. Critics argue that when platforms use algorithms to promote specific content, they're acting as publishers rather than neutral intermediaries and should lose their immunity protections. The regulatory response has been complicated by the technical complexity of algorithmic systems and the global nature of social media platforms. The European Union's Digital Services Act requires platforms to provide more transparency about their algorithmic systems, but enforcement remains challenging because the algorithms are constantly evolving and their effects are difficult to measure. The broader pattern shows how technological systems designed for one purpose can have unintended consequences that reshape society in fundamental ways. The social media platforms weren't necessarily trying to undermine democratic institutions or promote conspiracy theories, but their business models created incentives that had those effects. What makes this particularly relevant to conspiracy theories is how the platforms became both the subject of conspiracy theories and the primary mechanism for spreading them. Users who believed in government surveillance conspiracies were using platforms that were actually conducting their own forms of behavioral monitoring and influence operations through algorithmic curation. The irony is that many of the conspiracy theories about social media manipulation contained elements of truth, but they focused on the wrong mechanisms and motivations. The platforms weren't running secret government psychological operations, but they were using algorithmic systems that had similar effects on user behavior and belief formation. The documentation that emerged through whistleblower revelations and regulatory investigations showed that platform executives understood the social and political implications of their algorithmic systems, but prioritized business metrics over public welfare. This wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but it was a systematic pattern of corporate decision-making that prioritized profit over social responsibility. The conspiracy theories about tech company manipulation weren't entirely accurate in their details, but they correctly identified that these platforms were influencing user behavior in ways that weren't transparent or accountable to the public. The algorithmic amplification systems created many of the same effects that deliberate manipulation programs would have produced. But social media algorithmic manipulation was just one example of how corporate interests were operating behind the scenes in ways that most people assumed were impossible. The next revelations would show that some companies were literally trying to control the weather. Corporate weather modification cover-ups. The documented history of government psychological operations shows us that corporate manipulation programs weren't the only conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. The CIA's Project MK Ultra, which ran from 1953 to 1973, conducted illegal human experiments involving mind control, torture, and psychological manipulation on unwitting subjects. For decades, anyone who suggested the government was running secret programs to control human behavior got dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theorists. MK Ultra involved over 150 separate research projects conducted at universities, hospitals, and research institutions across the United States and Canada. The program used techniques, including electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and physical abuse, and administration of drugs like LSD without informed consent. Subjects included mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and ordinary citizens who had no idea they were being used as test subjects in government experiments. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the government was conducting mind control experiments were absolutely right, but they actually underestimated the scope and brutality of what was happening. MK Ultra wasn't just theoretical research into psychological manipulation, it was systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. The program violated every ethical standard for human experimentation and caused permanent psychological damage to thousands of victims. Project Mockingbird was another CIA operation that conspiracy theorists correctly identified before it became public knowledge. The program involved recruiting journalists and media executives to spread propaganda and disinformation through mainstream news outlets. The CIA was literally controlling news coverage to shape public opinion on foreign policy issues, domestic politics, and intelligence operations. Mockingbird gave the CIA influence over major newspapers, magazines, television networks, and publishing houses. Journalists were paid to write articles promoting CIA interests, while editors killed stories that might damage intelligence operations. The program allowed the agency to plant false stories, suppress unfavorable coverage, and manipulate public discourse on a massive scale. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government control of media were ridiculed by the same journalists who were secretly working for intelligence agencies. Critics who suggested that news coverage was being manipulated by government operatives were dismissed as paranoid extremists who didn't understand how journalism actually worked. The irony was that some of the journalists dismissing these theories were literally on CIA payrolls. Both MK Ultra and Mockingbird operated for decades without meaningful oversight or accountability. Congressional investigations in the 1970s revealed the existence of these programs, but most of the documentation had been destroyed to prevent exposure of illegal activities. The church committee hearings showed that intelligence agencies had been conducting domestic operations that violated their legal authorities and constitutional restrictions. The pattern here shows how institutional secrecy allows illegal programs to operate without detection or accountability. Intelligence agencies created compartmentalized operations where only a few people knew the full scope of what was happening. They used legitimate research institutions and media organizations as cover for illegal activities. They destroyed evidence and intimidated witnesses to prevent exposure of criminal behavior. Former CIA officials who became whistleblowers after these programs were exposed described a culture where illegal activities were normalized and justified as necessary for national security. The attitude was that constitutional restrictions and legal oversight were obstacles to effective intelligence operations rather than essential safeguards for democratic governance. The conspiracy theorists weren't just right about the existence of these programs, they correctly understood that government agencies would use their secrecy authorities to conduct illegal domestic operations. They predicted that intelligence agencies would target American citizens, manipulate media coverage, and destroy evidence of their crimes. The documented evidence proved that these predictions were accurate. What makes these historical cases particularly relevant is how they established patterns that continued into the digital age. The same institutional incentives that drove MK Ultra and Mockingbird created the surveillance programs that Snowden exposed decades later. The techniques for manipulating public opinion that were developed during Mockingbird evolved into the social media influence operations that we see today. The regulatory reforms that followed the church committee investigations were supposed to prevent future abuses, but they primarily focused on creating oversight mechanisms rather than eliminating the underlying authorities that enabled these programs. Intelligence agencies learned to operate within legal frameworks while still conducting activities that violated the spirit of constitutional protections. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government mind control and media manipulation understood something that mainstream experts missed. Institutional power will expand to fill available space unless it faces meaningful resistance. They correctly predicted that intelligence agencies would use their authorities for domestic political purposes rather than limiting themselves to foreign intelligence gathering. The documentation that survived government efforts to destroy evidence showed that these programs weren't aberrations or rogue operations. They were systematic institutional practices with high-level approval and coordination. The conspiracy theorists were right about both the existence of these programs and their integration into normal intelligence operations. But government psychological operations and media manipulation were just the beginning of how powerful institutions learn to hide their activities from public scrutiny. The next revelations would show that some of the most trusted institutions in society were systematically deceiving the public about matters of life and death. Pharmaceutical data manipulation schemes. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment stands as one of the most horrific examples of medical conspiracy theories that turned out to be completely true. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted a study on untreated syphilis in rural black men in Alabama, telling participants they were receiving free health care for bad blood. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the government was conducting illegal medical experiments on black Americans were dismissed as paranoid racists who didn't understand how medical research actually worked. The study recruited 399 black men with syphilis and 201 without the disease as a control group. The men were never told they had syphilis, never gave informed consent for the research, and were deliberately denied treatment even after penicillin was discovered as an effective cure in the 1940s. Researchers wanted to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis, so they actively prevented participants from receiving medical care that could have saved their lives. The Public Health Service worked with local medical providers to ensure the men didn't receive treatment elsewhere. They provided incentives like free meals, transportation, and burial insurance to keep participants in the study, while lying about the purpose of the research. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that covered various ailments, when they were actually being studied as they suffered and died from a treatable disease. The conspiracy extended beyond the original researchers to include the Centers for Disease Control, which continued the study after taking over from the Public Health Service in the 1960s. Medical professionals, public health officials, and government administrators all knew about the deception, but allowed it to continue for 4 decades. The study only ended in 1972 when a whistleblower leaked information to the press, forcing public exposure of the experiment. By the time the study ended, 128 participants had died from syphilis or related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The men who survived suffered from blindness, deafness, mental illness, and other complications that could have been prevented with proper treatment. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government medical experiments on vulnerable populations had been absolutely right about the scope and brutality of what was happening. The asbestos industry provides another example of corporate conspiracy theories that prove to be accurate. For decades, companies like Johns Manville, Ray Besto's Manhattan, and other asbestos manufacturers knew their products cause cancer and other deadly diseases, but deliberately hid this information from workers and the public. Internal company documents revealed a coordinated effort to suppress medical research, discredit scientists, and mislead regulatory agencies about the health risks of asbestos exposure. Company executives received medical reports as early as the 1930s showing that asbestos workers were developing lung diseases at alarming rates. Instead of warning workers or improving safety conditions, the companies hired their own doctors to conduct studies that would downplay the health risks. They funded research designed to create doubt about the link between asbestos and disease, while suppressing studies that showed clear evidence of harm. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of deception and cover-up. Companies removed warning labels from asbestos products, fought against workplace safety regulations, and lobbied government agencies to avoid restrictions on asbestos use. They hired public relations firms to spread disinformation about asbestos safety and funded front groups that appeared to be independent scientific organizations, but were actually industry propaganda operations. Workers who developed asbestos-related diseases were told their illnesses were caused by other factors like smoking or genetic predisposition. Company doctors would diagnose workers with less serious conditions to avoid acknowledging asbestos-related diseases that might trigger workers' compensation claims or regulatory scrutiny. The companies maintained this deception for decades while thousands of workers died from preventable diseases. The conspiracy theorists who claimed that corporations were deliberately poisoning workers for profit were ridiculed by industry experts and government officials who insisted that American companies would never knowingly harm their employees. Medical professionals who questioned asbestos safety were attacked as alarmists who didn't understand industrial hygiene. Worker advocates who demanded better safety protections were dismissed as anti-business extremists. The truth only emerged through litigation in the 1970s and 1980s when internal company documents were forced into public view through court proceedings. The documents revealed decades of deliberate deception, showing that company executives knew about asbestos dangers but chose to prioritize profits over worker safety. The conspiracy theorists had been right about both the scope of corporate knowledge and the deliberate nature of the cover-up. Both the Tuskegee experiment and the asbestos cover-up show how institutional power can operate in secret for decades while systematically harming vulnerable populations. The conspiracy theorists who warned about these programs understood something that mainstream experts missed. Institutions with power and secrecy will use that combination to serve their own interests rather than protecting the people they claim to serve. The pattern of denial, cover-up, and eventual exposure that characterized these historical cases would repeat itself in the digital age, where new technologies created new opportunities for surveillance and control. The same institutional incentives that drove medical experiments and corporate cover-ups would find expression in financial monitoring systems that government financial surveillance were impossible in democratic societies. The House Judiciary Committee's 2024 report exposed exactly what privacy advocates had been warning about for years: systematic financial surveillance operating far beyond legal boundaries. Federal agencies weren't just monitoring suspicious transactions, they were collecting private financial data on millions of Americans through back-channel communications with major banks and financial institutions. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the FBI had established direct data-sharing relationships with Bank of America, PayPal, Charles Schwab, HSBC, U.S. Bank, and Barclays. These weren't formal legal requests with judicial oversight. These were ongoing surveillance partnerships that allowed government agencies to monitor customer transactions in real time without warrants or probable cause. The surveillance programs used keyword filtering systems that targeted political terms like MAGA and Trump in transaction descriptions. Americans were being flagged for investigation based on purchases from stores like Cabela's, Bass Pro Shop, and Dick's Sporting Goods because government analysts decided these retailers attracted customers with Second Amendment interests. The surveillance wasn't targeting criminal activity, it was profiling Americans based on their political beliefs and constitutional rights.